For years, I told people not to worry about bitter vegetables. Spit it out, move on, no big deal. Then I read the case file on two women in France, one who made pumpkin soup, another who ate a bitter squash side dish, in two separate incidents, and both ended up with sudden hair loss weeks after severe food poisoning symptoms. I had to rethink everything I thought I knew about 8 ordinary crops sitting in your garden right now. Here's what I got wrong. Bitterness on its own isn't a warning sign, not for most of what you're growing. For 8 crops on this list, it's just flavor, annoying, fixable, nothing more. But for 2 of them, that same bitterness is your only warning before it makes you dangerously sick. Here's what's actually happening underneath all of this. Heat doesn't just stress your plants, it changes their chemistry. Every crop on this list responds to a heat wave by producing more of some defensive compound it was already making in small amounts. In most cases, that compound just tastes bad. In 2 cases, it's a genuine toxin, and the amount your plant produces can climb high enough to make you ill. Number 10, carrots. You pull a carrot out of the ground in July, and it tastes like dirt. Here's why. Carrots build their sweetness through a slow, steady conversion of stored starches into sugar. That process runs best in cool, even temperatures, 60 to 70 degrees. Push a carrot through a real heat wave, especially with uneven watering on top of it, and that conversion process falls apart. Sugar production drops. At the same time, the plant increases production of bitter defensive compounds called terpenoids, the same family of compound responsible for that sharp, almost turpentine taste some carrots get. The good news, this is entirely a flavor problem, not a safety one. Research on stressed carrots has specifically looked for harmful byproducts and found none. The plant's stress response stays within normal, safe limits. The fix is mostly about consistency. Water carrots on a steady schedule rather than letting them swing between bone dry and soaked. It's the swings that trigger the bitterness more than the heat alone. And if you've already pulled a bitter batch, don't write it off. Roasting breaks those bitter compounds down and caramelizes whatever sugar is still in there. A raw bitter carrot and a roasted one can taste like 2 completely different vegetables. Containers actually work in carrots' favor here, for a reason that has nothing to do with root space. A dark plastic pot sitting in full sun can run hotter than the ground around it, which makes the heat swing problem worse, not better. Choose a light-colored or unglazed container instead, and set it somewhere it gets relief from direct afternoon sun, a level of control you simply don't have with an in-ground bed. Number 9, broccoli. You go out to harvest, and the tight green head you were expecting has cracked open into loose yellow flowers. That's bolting. Heat tells the plant its growing season is ending, and its only job left is to reproduce fast. Every bit of energy that was going into building a tender, mild-tasting head gets redirected into flower production instead. And flowering tissue is bitter by design. It's part of how the plant defends its reproductive structures from being eaten before it can set seed. Once broccoli bolts, there's no reversing it, which is exactly why timing matters more than rescue here. Harvest the moment you see any yellow starting to show, even if the head looks smaller than you'd like. A slightly early harvest beats a fully bolted one every time, and the real fix happens earlier than that. Get broccoli in the ground soon enough that it matures before your region's real heat arrives. Once a heat wave hits a plant that hasn't headed yet, you're usually racing a clock you can't win. That clock runs faster in a container. Potting soil heats up quicker and holds that heat closer to the roots than an in-ground bed does. So container-grown broccoli often bolts earlier in a heat wave than the same variety planted directly in soil. If you're growing it in a pot, build in an extra buffer on your planting date rather than using the same timeline you'd use for a garden bed. Number 8. Spinach. This one moves fast. 1 week, you've got tender spinach leaves. The next, the plant has shot up a thick central stalk and stopped putting energy into leaves entirely. Spinach is one of the most heat-sensitive crops on this entire list. It doesn't wait for a sustained heat wave. A handful of days above 80 degrees is often enough to trigger bolting. Once that stalk appears, the plant is done producing new tender leaves. Spinach was never built to survive summer, so the real fix is timing, not rescue. Plant it early enough to harvest before your heat arrives, and treat any spinach caught in a real heat wave as a loss for that bed, rather than something to nurse back. If you want spinach through the hot months, a heat-tolerant variety grown with afternoon shade is a better bet than fighting the plant's biology. This is one of the few crops on this list where a container gives you a real edge over a garden bed simply because you can act fast. Since bolting can happen within days of a heat spike, being able to physically pick up the pot and move it into shade the moment a forecast turns is worth more here than any amount of planning ahead. A garden bed doesn't give you that option. Number 7. Radishes. You pull one up expecting the usual crisp bite, and instead you get something woody, hollow in the middle, and aggressively spicy, closer to horseradish than the radish you planted. Radishes make their peppery bite from compounds called glucosinolates, the same family responsible for the sharp flavor in mustard and horseradish. Under normal conditions, that bite is mild. Under heat stress, glucosinolate production spikes, and the flesh turns sharply, unpleasantly spicy. At the same time, the root's growth turns erratic, which is what leaves you with that woody texture and hollow core. Radishes are one of the fastest crops in the garden, which is exactly why timing solves most of this. Get them in the ground early enough that they mature before real heat sets in. Most varieties are ready in 3 to 4 weeks. If a heat wave catches them mid-growth, harvest early, rather than let them sit and get worse. A slightly small radish beats a woody, hollow one. Containers work against radishes a little here, and it's worth knowing why. Potting mix dries out faster than garden soil, so the moisture swings that drive that woody, hollow texture happen more easily in a pot than in the ground. If you're growing radishes in containers through a heat wave, check the soil daily rather than sticking to a set watering schedule. The faster drying means the usual rules don't quite apply. Number 6. Arugula. Arugula is supposed to have a peppery bite. That's the whole appeal. But there's a real line between peppery and what a heat-stressed arugula plant will actually give you. Same mechanism as radishes, glucosinolates, but arugula starts from a much higher baseline, so a heat wave pushes it into overwhelming territory, faster than it does with milder greens. On top of the chemical shift, arugula bolts quickly in heat, and bolted leaves get tougher and more bitter on top of the pepperiness already building. Harvest arugula young, and often during warm weather, instead of waiting for full-size leaves. Younger leaves simply haven't built up as much of the compound yet. Afternoon shade genuinely helps here, more than with most greens on this list. And if a batch does turn overwhelming, don't write it off. Chopped fine, a small amount of very peppery arugula can still work in a dish built around it. A whole bowl of it as a salad base is where it stops being enjoyable. This is where containers actually make the harvest young and often strategy easier to pull off. A few small pots staggered a week or two apart give you a rotating supply of young leaves without needing to divide up space in a garden bed. When one pot starts bolting and turning sharp, it's already time to start the next one, rather than trying to manage that timing within a single crowded row. Number 5. Cucumbers. Here's where this list changes. Cucumbers get bitter from a defensive compound called cucurbitacin. I guess the plant's evolved response to stress, whether that's drought, uneven watering, or heat. But cucurbitacin isn't just a bitter compound, it's a genuine toxin. In high enough concentrations, it causes what's now documented in medical literature as toxic squash syndrome, severe gastrointestinal illness, and in the worst recorded cases, effects reaching the liver and kidneys. Cases are rare, but they're real, and they're documented in peer-reviewed medical sources, not internet rumor. Here's the part that makes this dangerous rather than just unpleasant. Cucurbitacin doesn't cook out. It's heat stable. Boiling it, frying it, grilling it, none of that neutralizes it. The only defense you have is your own sense of taste. And specifically, taking that first bite seriously instead of pushing through it because you don't want to waste a cucumber. So make tasting a habit, not an afterthought. Before you commit a whole cucumber to a dish, especially one grown during a stretch of real heat or uneven watering, taste a small piece first. A faint bitterness right near the stem end is normal and nothing to worry about. But if it's sharp and unmistakable, running through more of the cucumber than just that one spot, stop. Don't try to salt it out. Don't try to cook around it. Discard the whole fruit. If you've already eaten a bitter cucumber and you're dealing with stomach pain, nausea, or diarrhea that came on shortly after, that's worth taking seriously. Reach out to a doctor or poison control rather than waiting it out. With cucumbers, a container raises the stakes rather than lowering them. Since cucurbitacin production is triggered by uneven watering as much as by heat itself, and potting mix dries out faster than garden soil, a container-grown cucumber is more exposed to the exact trigger you're trying to avoid. If you're growing cucumbers in pots this summer, a consistent watering schedule isn't just good practice, it's your main defense against the plant producing this compound in the first place. That's cucumber. If this kind of thing is useful to you, the stuff most gardening advice skips, this is a good moment to subscribe. Number 4, lettuce. You reach for a lettuce leaf, expecting the usual mild crunch, and instead get something sharp and faintly bitter, almost herbal in a way that's unpleasant. That's the plant's milky white sap, a latex compound most lettuce varieties produce in tiny amounts normally, but ramp up dramatically once a heat wave triggers bolting. The sap concentrates in the leaves as the plant redirects energy toward the flowering stalk, and it's what gives bolted lettuce that unmistakable bitter edge. Unlike the last crop, this is purely a flavor problem. Lettuce sap in these amounts is unpleasant, not dangerous. It's worth checking the whole plant before you write it off, though. Once lettuce bolts, the outer leaves are usually the worst. The inner, younger leaves near the center often stay milder longer. Beyond that, timing and shade are your best tools. Plant heat-tolerant or bolt-resistant varieties for summer specifically, and afternoon shade can buy you real extra weeks before bolting starts. A container gives you one real advantage with lettuce that a garden bed doesn't: root temperature control. Lettuce roots are especially sensitive to heat, more so than the leaves themselves. And a pot lets you tuck it somewhere the root zone stays cooler. Against a shaded wall, under a bench, anywhere the sun doesn't bake the sides of the container. That kind of placement isn't something you can do with a row planted in open ground. Number 3, basil. Basil doesn't bolt the same dramatic way lettuce or spinach does, but extreme heat does something almost as noticeable. It shifts the plant's essential oil chemistry. The sweet, slightly anise-like flavor most people associate with basil comes from a specific balance of aromatic compounds. Push the plant into sustained heat stress, and that balance tilts toward compounds that read as sharper, more medicinal, almost clove-like instead of sweet. It's a real measurable chemical shift, not just your taste buds having an off day. Basil is more forgiving than most of the crops on this list because the fix is simple. Pinch off flower buds the moment you see them forming. Flowering is what accelerates this chemical shift, so consistent pinching keeps the plant in a more vegetative state and the flavor closer to what you planted it for. Afternoon shade during the hottest stretch of summer helps too, especially in a container where you can move the plant entirely. Of everything on this list, basil is the one where a container is genuinely the better choice over a garden bed, heat wave or not. It roots shallowly, tolerates being moved without much stress, and does well being shifted through the day. Morning sun on a patio, afternoon shade against the house. That kind of flexibility is hard to replicate with basil planted directly in the ground. Number 2, cilantro. Cilantro is famous for splitting people into two camps, those who love it and those who say it tastes like soap. That soap reaction is genetic, tied to a specific gene variant your garden has no influence over. What heat does change is something else entirely. Cilantro bolts faster than almost any herb you grow, just a few hot days near 90 degrees, and it's already sending up a flower stalk. Once it bolts, the leaves shift from that bright, citrusy flavor toward something sharper and more bitter. Succession planting is the real answer here. Sow a new batch every few weeks through the season instead of expecting one planting to carry you through summer. Once a batch bolts, let it go to seed on purpose. That seed is coriander, a completely usable spice. So a bolted cilantro plant isn't wasted. It's just become a different crop. One container detail matters more for cilantro than almost anything else on this list. Sow it directly into the pot it's going to live in. Cilantro has a long taproot that resents being disturbed, and the stress of transplanting it from a seed tray into a container can trigger bolting on its own, heat wave or not. Skip the tray entirely and save yourself that risk. Number 1, zucchini and summer squash. Everything you just learned about cucumbers applies here too. Same defensive compound, cucurbitacin, same reason it shows up, and it's heat stable. So cooking never neutralizes it. But zucchini is where this risk actually gets serious. In 2018, a French woman made soup from a homegrown pumpkin and came down with violent vomiting and diarrhea within hours. Weeks later, she started losing her hair. In a separate case around the same time, another woman in France had the same reaction to a bitter squash side dish and lost her hair too. Doctors traced both back to cucurbitacin poisoning, a concentration high enough to affect hair follicles the same way certain chemotherapy drugs do. Here's why hair loss, of all things, is what tipped doctors off. Cucurbitacin interferes with cell division, the same basic mechanism some chemotherapy drugs use, which is why chemo causes hair loss as a side effect. Hair follicles are some of the fastest dividing cells in the body, so they're hit hardest. This isn't an allergic reaction or an infection. It's the compound disrupting cell division wherever cells divide fastest. That's an extreme case. But it illustrates something every zucchini and squash grower needs to know. Modern varieties have been bred over generations specifically to keep cucurbitacin levels low enough that you'd never taste them. That breeding can occasionally be undone. If a squash plant in your garden cross-pollinates with a wild or ornamental gourd, which happens more easily than most gardeners realize, since bees don't check variety labels, the seed it produces can carry genes for much higher cucurbitacin levels. So concede you've saved yourself from a squash that wasn't a stable, true breeding variety. Add heat and drought stress on top of that, and cucurbitacin levels can climb even in an otherwise normal plant. The same rule from cucumber applies here, and it matters even more. Taste a small piece before cooking with any zucchini or summer squash, especially one grown from saved seed or in a summer with real heat stress. If it's sharply, unmistakably bitter, not the very faint bitterness that's sometimes normal near the stem, but a bitterness that makes you want to spit it out immediately, stop. Discard the entire fruit. Don't feed it to pets either. Cucurbitacin affects animals the same way, often more severely given their smaller size. Buy seed from reputable sources rather than saving your own unless you know exactly what variety you're working with. And if anyone in your household develops sudden, severe stomach illness after eating homegrown squash, mention that detail specifically to a Dr. E. It's not a common diagnosis, and naming the exact vegetable is often what helps them connect it. This is also where a container earns its place on this list, not for space, but for isolation. Growing squash in a pot lets you physically isolate it. Far from any wild or ornamental gourds elsewhere in the yard, the exact cross-pollination risk that raises cucurbitacin levels in the first place. That distance is far easier to control on a patio than in an open garden bed next to a decorative gourd vine you forgot was even flowering. 10 crops. 8 of them are a flavor problem you can work around. 2 of them deserve your full attention every single time you pick one. A few questions always come up around this, so let's clear them up directly. Can you just cut off the bitter part and eat the rest? No. Cucurbitacin spreads unevenly through the fruit, so a bitter taste in one spot doesn't mean the rest is safe. Discard the whole thing. Does salting draw the bitterness out? For some vegetables, yes, but not this one. Salting can dull how bitter something tastes to you without touching the cucurbitacin itself. A salted bitter zucchini is still toxic. Are heirloom varieties riskier than hybrids? Not inherently. It comes down to seed-saving practices, not the heirloom label. Commercial hybrid seed is produced under controlled conditions that keep cucurbitacin levels low and consistent. Home-saved seed, heirloom or not, loses that control the moment cross-pollination with a wild or ornamental gourd happens nearby. A heat wave doesn't just wilt your garden, it changes what's actually inside the plants you're growing, sometimes in ways you can taste, and in a couple of cases, in ways you genuinely need to catch before you cook. Growing in containers doesn't eliminate any of this, but it does give you a level of control an open garden bed can't. Moving a plant into shade, isolating it from cross-pollination, controlling exactly how much water it gets and when. Use that control. The habit that protects you either way isn't complicated. Taste before you commit a whole cucumber or zucchini to a meal. Trust that reaction when it says something's wrong. I'm Elias Ford. This is The Honest Root. See you in the next one.